break. Let's start with session number 2 on differential impact of natural disasters, loss and damage, response and recovery. We're going to hear about studies from Asia and Africa, and the first presenter is Kees van der Geest from the United Nations University in Bonn, and he's going to present on loss and damage from climate change, household vulnerability profiles. The floor is all yours.
Should I take the mic or?
Sure.
Maybe.
Do you want to stand?
Yeah, maybe. It's not so long, right? Okay. Then.
Do you have different mic?
It's okay, I can just.
Is that the mic?
Oh, you're not in my, right?
Yeah, without the cord.
It's okay, I'll just sit. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Wow. Yeah, so I changed the title a little bit. It's now called Vulnerability, Coping and Loss and Damage from Climate Events. And I'm presenting also on behalf of my boss, Koko. We're at the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security in Bonn. So I'm going to talk about loss and damage, which is, I'll explain what it is later, so just go through the outline of the presentation now. So after explaining a little bit with what loss and damage is, because it's a new topic, maybe not everybody is familiar with it yet, present a conceptual framework and then move to the more empirical work that we have done in our case studies. Now I will not present all findings from the cases, so I try to focus on really what is interesting for this particular workshop. So next I will move into a vulnerability index that we made just for the purpose of our case studies. It's not something that we want everybody to use or anything. And then I look specifically at what kind of coping strategies households use in response to impacts of climate events. And then the loss and damage is about the extent to which these coping measures are actually successful or effective in avoiding impacts or residual impacts. So first, what is loss and damage? I'm not really sure how familiar everybody is with this topic. It's a topic that actually came from the negotiations, the climate negotiations, I guess. Often you see that academics, researchers start investigating a certain theme, and then it moves to the policy, the world of policy. But in this case, it's been the opposite. Loss and damage is a topic that small island states, least developed countries, like the most vulnerable countries, have really actively tried to put it on the agenda of the UNFCCC negotiations on climate change. So loss and damage is about, well, here's a simple definition. It's adverse effects of climatic stressors that occur despite mitigation and adaptation efforts. So these countries wanted to draw attention to the fact that what has been done so far in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving what we do to adapt to climatic changes, all that has not been enough to avoid losses and damages. So I will talk here more specifically about impacts of extreme events, climate events, including droughts, I must say. But loss and damage is also about impacts of slow onset changes, sea level rise, permafrost melt, these kind of things, rising temperatures. But the focus here is a bit more on floods and droughts, cyclones. It's also important to realize that the words loss and damage come from insurance. It's really about usually it is really about monetary losses, damages that you can actually put a dollar mark on. But the topic of loss and damage, as it is emerging now, there's been important efforts to emphasize that it's also about loss of culture, loss of identity associated with climatic changes and people's responses. So if you're a pastoralist in Burkina Faso, you lose your herds, you lose your cattle in a drought, and you have to move to an urban center. There are physical losses that you can count, number of cows, but there's also the loss of identity when you can no longer do what generations before you have been doing. So here's a little framework. I don't know how visible it is to everybody in the room, but it's something we drew up to sort of make sense of what we were actually studying. So at the top there is a vulnerability, and we distinguish vulnerability at different levels. So you have a collective vulnerability and individual vulnerability, where I guess the topic of this conference would be more on the right side, right? There are you can see some variables there that are more demographic. And so, but I think it is important to realize that there are these differences in vulnerability, not just because you're old or young, or because you're a man or a woman, but also like where you live, whether you live in a country with a high level of preparedness of your government or not, things like that. So actually these characteristics of the environment where you live, plus your own household's characteristics, sort of determine what you do for a living, your current livelihood strategy, we've called it, and also what you usually do to avoid risk. So if you're a farmer somewhere, maybe in Africa, you know that's on the left-hand side of vulnerability. You know what more or less the frequencies of droughts are in your area, and that maybe determines what kind of crops you want to grow, and what other kind of risk management strategies you want to put in place. So there, in the middle, where you see the sun and the clouds, you see where the figure sort of splits between adaptation to climatic changes and coping with climatic events. And loss and damage can result from both streams. So if there is a drought, some households may be impacted, some households maybe not. So the green one here, I don't know whether I should use this pointer actually. How does the pointer work, or is that the other one? Okay. So if there's a drought somewhere, some people will experience impacts and some will not. If you don't have any impacts, if there's a drought but you don't grow crops and your crops don't fail, probably there's no reason to adopt any coping measures. So that one is green, there will be no loss and damage. If you're affected, you can adopt coping measures, and whether or not they are successful will determine whether later on there will be a loss and damage or not. So that's moving down to coping, no coping, successful coping, and loss and damage. And there are these blue arrows back, which you probably can't read the text. It's for sort of a feedback loop, taking into account that these losses then affect people's vulnerability in a next cycle of drought. So usually also in the IPCC report, there's no specific definition in the glossary of coping. Everything is put under adaptation. So coping would probably there be called something like ex post adaptation or so, or reactive adaptation, where the preventive measures would be like proactive adaptation or so. I think it's really useful to split these different household responses, because they are in response to different stressors. So you have the normal variability of the weather, which is something like the what you can expect in a certain area, the frequencies of droughts. You can put preventive measures in place to minimize the risk that you get crop failures. For example, by spreading sowing dates, sowing in high and low areas, different crop mix. And then there are things that you do when there is actually a drought and you're affected. And then the third line on climatic changes and adaptation is when you see that the weather, the climate in your surroundings is changing, you might want to change actually in the longer term what you're doing and how you manage risk in the longer term. Yeah. So what we did 2 years ago, we were asked to go into this new topic of loss and damage, and just go to 9 countries in the world to study whether like loss and damage is something of the future, where if we live in a plus 4 degree world, or if extreme events will increase in frequency, what will happen? What will the loss and damage be? We had the impression that there is already loss and damage. It's not just something of the future. So we went to these 9 countries. I'll tell you later which they were. So we mostly looked at rural areas where we expected the impacts of these climatic changes on people's livelihoods to be most severe. Now we wanted to go to places, of course, where we expected the climate to be a threat, climatic changes, climatic events. But I would say that they're not real hotspots usually. I think they're quite representative for people living in developing countries in general. So we are now 2 years down the road, and the 9 case studies, so we worked with researchers from these countries, and they have all published one journal article and a case study report. And so far, the way they describe their results has been very descriptive, very like they do not really go into much depth on how losses and damage vary between different types of households, for example. They would just present findings for the whole group because they were under some time pressure, and it takes some time to really make sense of these more complex relations. So luckily I now get a chance to do that myself. So this paper will go into that soon. So what I will have to probably speed up a bit. So on methods, I'll just keep it short. What I'll present here is really based on a questionnaire survey, questionnaire interviews. We did a number of more qualitative methods, but and that is helpful for understanding the survey data better, but it's not really presented here. So actually, I guess the question I tried to answer in this paper is about the relation between household vulnerability and coping. So can we see patterns in like the level of vulnerability of households and the choice of or portfolio of coping strategies that they adopt when they are faced with the impacts of a climate event. And then secondly, can we say that, do we see that certain types of households are more able to avoid loss and damage than others? And also, do we see that certain coping measures are more associated with success of avoiding loss and damage than others? So these are, I look here at 4 of our case study areas. It's because 3 of the countries we don't have access to the original raw data, and then that's Mozambique, Burkina Faso, and Ethiopia. And then for 2 case studies, Bhutan and Micronesia, they were not included here because Micronesia turned out to be so different from the others. It was more like a developed country. So when you put them all together, that changed the sort of the findings for the rest to such an extent where, while these 4 were actually quite similar, so it made more sense to focus on these 4. And in Bhutan, the last one that was excluded, that Bhutan looked at GLOFs, glacial lake outburst floods, and it turned out to be that was sort of a wrong choice of stressor because it had affected only very few people in the area. Okay. Yeah. So, just briefly on this vulnerability index, we did not know that we're going to use any kind of vulnerability index before we started. So, I had to use the data that were generated through the questionnaire survey, look back and see what variables that we had would be suitable for such an analysis. And so the 10 are listed on the right. So for each we made a 5-point scale where 1 is the least vulnerable and 5 is most vulnerable, and then we averaged the scores without any weighing so far. And looking back, what I see is that it's the index seems pretty strong on coping capacity and not so strong on exposure. There were just some data that we did not gather systematically for all the case studies, which would have been good on exposure. And I just show one slide with 2 maps made by Sisin, there where you see that very clearly. On the left hand you see the presence of mangroves, and on the right hand side you see household reported impacts. So the red ones is where people reported severe impacts, and the green is no impact. So you see exactly where there are no mangroves, the impacts are most severe. So that is not covered in the vulnerability index nor in the data. Just luckily for Micronesia, we recorded GPS data, but that was not done systematically. Anyway, so this is just showing the distribution among. So we have like 1,500 households here, and these are their scores on the vulnerability index. And we can use that to sort of map out differences between case study areas. Here, the more closer you are to the center, the red area would be more vulnerable and green would be less vulnerable. So you see that in some areas would be vulnerable for very different reasons. I'm sorry I have to sort of rush through this a bit because I took too much time on the introduction. So on the horizontal axis there's vulnerability. The more to the right, the more vulnerable. And then there's impact. The number of the proportion of households reporting either no impacts, that's the blue, moderate impacts, and severe impacts. So you see a little bit that very few people actually were not affected at all. And then you see that with higher vulnerability, the likelihood of reporting severe impacts would increase. Now on the right hand side, we see, I guess very clearly, that the main sector that was affected were crops, crop cultivation. And also, maybe I did not really expect that directly at the beginning, was the on food prices. So taking these two together, I would say like food security is really at risk in some of these areas. And the other, which is very high, would have merited a separate category. That's health impacts, when they specified. That's like 80% of that is health related. So people use different measures to cope with these impacts. And so we had like closed questions on 7 types of coping strategies, which are listed here. And so here we wanted to find out whether certain measures were associated with higher vulnerability and certain measures were associated with lower vulnerability. And when you see a low P-score, that means that there is a significant difference there, which is the case for the use of social networks, reliance on friends and relatives when you're hit by a drought or a flood, which is more common among the more vulnerable households. Same for modifying food consumption. That could be eating cheaper food or less food, less meals a day, smaller portion sizes, which actually you could wonder whether that is really a coping strategy or a sign that coping measures are not successful. And actually there was only one that is more clearly associated with less vulnerable households. That's the other category, which when we did some more qualitative analysis of the other category, turned out that was mostly loans, taking loans, borrowing money. Yeah. I'm going to skip this one. So on the left, maybe the differences between countries do not matter so much, but just to show that 70% almost across the study areas reported that their coping measures were not enough to avoid loss and damage. And on the right hand side you see there's a clear relation between that vulnerability index and the ability to avoid loss and damage. But maybe an equally interesting finding is that even the very least vulnerable would still report, over 50% of them would still report losses. Just moving quickly into the last finding. Here we wanted to see whether the uptake or the use of certain coping measures were more associated with the ability to avoid loss and damage or not. And here I must say that the differences that we find are not very significant or impressive. And actually I hope maybe by the end of this workshop I get some ideas or maybe advice from people in the room who are more familiar with this type of analysis to find out an effective way of analyzing this better, taking into account that people use a number of measures. So the same person who used like non-farm income to buy food after a drought may also have sold his cattle to buy food, or sent a son to the city to work. So there are these combination of household strategies. So I need to find a better way of combining that. So I think most of the conclusions I put here is more like a summary. Just maybe one thing that I still will say is that so there were some measures that were more common among more vulnerable households, but there were some which you would probably expect to be more common among more vulnerable houses, like the reliance on relief, support from organizations, food aid, etc. There was like the least vulnerable households, or were just as likely to use that as a coping strategy as the more vulnerable houses, and the same for migration actually. Okay, I think I'll leave it like that. I hope I didn't do too bad time-wise.
It's fine, I can take this one. Thanks. Yeah, let's turn to questions right away, please.
Okay, I have two questions. And one question and one comment, I would say. For the first question, and you, in the very beginning, you mentioned that when we talk about loss and damage, that's, according to the concept, should be under the condition of mitigation adaptation effort, right? So then you talk, but it's not clear to me that how you consider the efforts in adaptation and mitigation. Then you talk about the damage and loss, and of course people are talking about avoided damage. That's avoided damage or loss or avoided impacts, and that's a concept like similar, based on the loss and damage, and that is more like quantifiable than this. I don't know, how you can you use that concept as well in this kind of case studies, and that's a question. And another comment I have that, from your analysis, it's very clear that when you look at Micronesia, and if you don't put the spatial dimension into the analysis, then you may definitely go to the kind of a wrong conclusion. And I'm glad that you exclude that analysis from here. So I would say, the spatial dimension and the real location of exposure should be put into the function. And we need to stress that. But we don't have enough knowledge, and we need that kind of expertise. That's an observation.
Yeah, your first question, thank you very much. Very valid comments. So on mitigation adaptation, so what we looked at really was autonomous responses of people's responses to these stressors, which of course take place in the context of more planned adaptation. So if you're a farmer in Nepal, what you do yourself to avoid impacts is done in relation to what your government or NGOs are doing, maybe in terms of building dikes or introducing water-resistant crop varieties, etc. So the people's responses were here studied in the context of what was done by organizations, governments, etc. And on the mitigation side, we decided not to look much at mitigation, because we feel that mitigation should definitely be part of any definition of loss and damage, because the more effort goes into reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the longer term would reduce the severity of climatic changes. So, but for when you go out to do field work among vulnerable people, the mitigation part becomes a bit less pressing. Yeah? Now, on the spatial dimensions, I clearly recognize that location has to be there, and I guess there is a difference between different types of stressors. So this was about coastal flooding, coastal erosion, impacts of storm surges, where location is definitely important. The same for flood, maybe little bit less for drought. And now I think the really interesting question here is whether the other 10 indices would correlate strongly with location of dwelling. Wouldn't it in most cases be so that the poorest people will end up living in the most risk-prone areas? So there is a question here, but I totally agree that if possible, these should definitely be included. Now, one last remark on that. We had an open question in the questionnaire, which simply asked people, do you consider yourself more vulnerable or less vulnerable or average compared to other people in your community? And then we asked them to explain why. And there actually location came out very, very clearly, because they said, well, we are not vulnerable at all to this flood because we are living in an upland area and we have our farms around our house. We are not vulnerable to this flood. So I think that teaches me two things, that you really have to ask people's perception. You can come up with a index. You think of an index beforehand in your office, and they say this is what really should make people vulnerable. But if you don't go out and really ask them, then you may miss out on a few important things.
Thank you very much. I have 3 questions, mostly on the conceptual issue. There is a strong sense in the climate change and the compensation for the ongoing climate change about the additionality. Sort of much of the socioeconomic development is going on anyhow, irrespective and independently of climate change. And many of particularly the non-material things that you mentioned, like having to move out of a farming environment to a city, it's happening on a massive scale all over the world without climate change. So how do you factor in what would be going on without climate change, and what is the additionality due to climate change? Because that seems to be a key issue here. The second point is about the relative scale of losses. Like if a farmer has hundreds of cows and he loses one, so what? But if a farmer has only 1 or 2 cows and he loses one, that's a big issue. All these insurance data, and so they measure any kind of loss, but they don't see how serious the loss is relative to the livelihood and the needs of the person. So maybe you can say a word on here. And the last question is also this multidimensional index that you used. I know it's been fashionable for a while, and UNDP even based the Human Development Index on this, but they're moving away from it now. The main problem I see is that if you have a very multidimensional indicator with many different components, it's very hard to derive policy priorities from this. So if you want to know, like in this circumstances, which clearly is undesirable, where in many dimensions the household is underprivileged and difficult conditions. Now you want to know, is it better to invest in food security or in sanitation or in education? So where is the best handle to and if you have only put it all together in one pot and stir around, you have no analytical approach to this. So the question is, wouldn't it be more meaningful to separate the different parts than to put them all together?
Okay. May I ask, due to the time, that we collect the questions at this point and you answer them all then together? There were 2 more over here and 1 over there. Yeah, Erich first, then you 2.
Just adding on to Wolfgang's comment, and I'm here, sorry. And to your previous answer on the correlation between locations and the different dimensions that you have in your multi-dimensional vulnerability index, you said you're not using any weighting at the moment, but I would suggest that something like that should be done, particularly because different dimensions may be of different importance, not only in those very different countries that you're looking at, but also in different places within that country. To just mention income as an example, not having an income might make you much more vulnerable, or yeah, the vulnerability induced by not having income differs by whether you are near a market or very far away in a rural area where a financial income is maybe not that important. And so I think there should be some kind of weighting depending on where you live, which country, and where in that country.
It is interesting to ask the question, when does location matter and when not? And so I think taking the example of drought, a severe drought in an affect production there and incomes in that region, but also, as you pointed out, affect food prices, which can then go on to impact in an adverse way the well-being of, for example, the urban poor who must buy their food in markets. So I mean, when we focus on location, we also have to think about the system within which that affected location exists and the sort of ramifications of a shock to one part of the system on the well-being of others in another part. So you didn't mention the urban aspects of the study, but it would be interesting to know whether food price shocks faced by the poor related to droughts elsewhere were part of the study.
So you mentioned the role of social networks, and I was just wondering if you have any information about the role of the extended family, for instance, in terms of transfers, and maybe the distribution of the family in geographic terms, if that is a way to sort of absorb different type of risks. If there are transfers of resources within the extended family, and so on.
So I have 2 minutes to answer these many very, very good questions. So some will be done in the coffee breaks. Let me see. Yeah, I think the about the weighting. Sorry, I'm just picking the weighting here. I think it is definitely something I will do. And if you look, there was, for example, livestock ownership was one of the indicators, which is like super important in Gambia and Kenya, in the more or dryland environments where, like from ages back, people cope with droughts by selling livestock. But if you go to Nepal, maybe it's not so important at all. So yes, definitely we have to do that. Now, the relative scale of losses, I think that was a very, very, very good comment, and I totally agree. And it is something that has to be repeated over and over again, because there's a real risk of the loss and damage field moving into a compensation, liability, insurance kind of direction, which I think is not the way to go, because if you express losses just in monetary terms, the rich will and the least vulnerable will often report the highest losses. Like the damage from Hurricane Sandy, I'm just guessing here, but could be in monetary terms just as much as a decade of droughts in Africa, you know, in terms of monetary value of crop losses. So definitely that's not the way to go. So in our case studies, it's like we don't go much into that. We go into what it means for farmers and whether the things they do to cope are actually sometimes just like a short-term survival, and what kind of impacts those short-term measures actually have on longer-term livelihood sustainability. We use the term erosive coping there, which is it's really about what it means to people if you try to to get access to food after a drought. Maybe you take your children from school to send them to urban center to sell chewing gum in the street. So what does that do in the longer term to people's livelihoods? So it should really be about that, I think, and not about money.
I'm hoping, I'm sure you will find time during coffee breaks and during lunch to discuss more on this. I can clearly see there's a lot to discuss about. Sorry, we have to move on, and I would like to call Dani Alfah up here to present on demographic differentials in vulnerability and resilience in a disaster-prone community in Indonesia, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, he comes from System Meter.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank for the organization to invite us to present this paper. The topic is demographic differential and vulnerability and resilience in a disaster-prone community, evidence from the longitudinal study of Merapi 2012. This is joint work. Myself with my colleagues Bondan Sikoki, Roni Hermoko, and Wayan Suriastini. I'm presenting this the paper, and my colleagues Bondan Sikoki will join me later in talking question during the discussion. For the background, is Merapi is one of the most active volcano in the world. Erupted every 4 to 5 years. The last eruption in October 2010 was the largest eruption in the past 50 years. The eruption caused close to 400 fatalities, result in massive infrastructure and property damage to the villages, and caused the evacuation up to 400,000 people, damaged 40 villages, disrupted several economic activities and livelihood. One way to reduce or minimize effect of a disaster is to implement knowledge-based strategy to increase the community disaster preparedness and resilience. Living in disaster-prone country like Indonesia, gives enough experience and lesson toward on how to adapt to the risk. The objective is to investigate how households living around an active volcano cope with this risk and uncertainties. The study the impact of Merapi eruption on the communities living around the volcano, and to study how each demographic and socio-economic subgroup differ in terms of resiliency, using a measure of resilience that we constructed from the data. In particular, we look how the index is different across demographic and socio-economic subgroup and across area that with different types of disaster risk. Use the data from 2010 longitudinal study Merapi. That's 102,019 households were randomly chosen from area with different level of disaster risk. The one is area terdampak langsung letusan or ATLL, the high damage area, areas that were directly hit by the superheated gas where human lives were lost. 2. Area terdampak letusan or ATL is medium damage, area that were exposed to the superheated gas but where no human lives were lost. And 3, area terdampak lahar hujan or ATLH. This area is area that were hit by the cold volcano mud flow, and 4 areas that were not affected by the 2010 eruption as the control area. And all classification of this area follow the definition from the Indonesian National Board of Disaster Management or Badan Nasional Penanggulangan Bencana. The methodology contracts index of resilience to measure the resilience in different parts of the affected area using John Twigg 5 indicator. The indicator were developed based on the characteristic of the resilient community. 5 dimension is: one is governance, include planning, policy, priority, public and commitment, legal and regulatory system, integration into development planning and policies, integration into emergency response and recovery, partnership and accountability and community participation. Number 2 is risk assessment, data assessment and hazard risk, assessment on vulnerability and impact. Number 3, John Twigg says knowledge and education, include public awareness, knowledge and skill, education and training. Number 4 is risk management and vulnerability reduction, include environmental management and natural resources, health and well-being, social protection, financial devices, and the last is preparedness and disaster response, include institutional capacity and coordination, early warning system, preparedness and contingency planning, participation, volunteerism, and accountability. Contraction of resilience index, we use dummy variable and sum them up for each dimension, then apply weight for each dimension based on expert perception on the importance of each dimension. The weight is: governance is 21.67%, risk assessment is 12.50%, knowledge and education is 22.50%, risk management is 18.33%, preparedness and disaster response is 25%. The compare of the index resilience between each subgroup of population within and between disaster area. Independent variable is age, sex, education, work in agriculture, household composition, having children above 5 years, having elderly in household, and income. Result and discussion. We start. Okay. We start to by logging the impact of the eruption in the various affected area is ATLL, ATL, and ATLH. The table reveal that in every count, the ATLL or the high damage area are the most hit by eruption. This is the area located for 5 to 10 kilometers, the top of the Merapi. The land is very fertile. Agriculture and raising livestock are the main source of livelihood, and the community. It is obvious that the damage of farm and livestock in this area is highest. On the other hand, loss in fishing farming. This loss fishing farming was experienced more in ATL. Other economic impact of the Merapi is loss of job and decrease of income. Almost half households in the high damage area report lost job. That's lost job is 44 and 6%. However, they were very quick in adapting themselves by changing their livelihood to non-agriculture job. The survey record that shortly after the eruption, they moved to service industry, mostly in commerce, change job, mostly in commerce, and moved back to farm when the situation is improved. Impact on education, in education and health are almost equally felt in all affected area. One of consequences of the eruption was tremendous damage to housing and public facilities, along with disruption of access and source of water. Among this physical damage, the disruption of access due piles of volcanic material and fallen, there is the highest damage in the high damage area. Disruption of water source due the pile of ashes and volcanic material create a lot of havoc. The disruption of access and water resource also felt in other area with lesser intensity. To measure resilience, we construct an index using the thematic area described by John Twigg. Twigg about the disaster resilient community, they namely dimension 1 is government, dimension 2 is risk assessment, dimension 3 knowledge and education, dimension 4 is risk management and vulnerability reduction, and dimension 5 is preparedness and disaster response. The resilience index based on the data from longitudinal Merapi show that although Merapi eruption almost regularly every 4 to 5 years, the resilience of the community is still very low. The total is 40 and 40.3%. The resilience is of the community is still very low. The overall index is 40.3%. However, it also shows that the government has made effort in preparing the community against the disaster, such early warning system, rule and regulation for disaster risk reduction. The index shows that the government and risk assessment is among the highest compared other dimension. Indeed, the government support is in systematic and strategic policy and action, in identification of disaster risk in important area. The role of government is very vital in producing policies to reduce vulnerability not only when the disaster occurs, but the anticipation of the disaster. Most especially, eruption of Merapi is cyclical. Legal and regulatory systems should be in place. Risk reduction should be integrated in planning, and there is integrated policy for emergency response and recovery. Although there is indication that it has been practiced, but there is still room to improvement. Other areas as indicated by the indicators such as knowledge and education, risk management and preparedness and disaster response still far from being satisfactory. Next, we present resilient index for different affected area. This appears that in area with high vulnerability, such as the high damage, area experiences higher resilience than in the medium damage area. In all dimensions, the index is higher except knowledge and education. That there are no difference between this affected area. The communities in the high damage area are much more prepared and respond to disaster better than communities in others area. Similarly, government response is more apparent. Now we look into differences in resilience among the subgroup of population. The table presents the odds ratio various demographic and socio-economic independent variable against the resilient index. Older population or having older person, all children under 5 years in the household are most vulnerable to disaster and have lower resilience. There are loss like prepare in the event of disaster because they have low participation in the community meeting that discuss about disaster risk reduction. And also on where to regulatory government awareness. There are no differences between sex, however men are knowledge about disaster risk than women. Education also have positive influence of resilience, having higher education, are better knowledge, better prepared and have high participation in the community that lead to higher resilience. Contrary to the expectation that agriculture household will be more vulnerable to their dependence on the climate change, they are more resilient than those in non-agriculture. No? Okay. Conclusion: vulnerability to volcanic eruption depends significantly on the area where the people live. The closer they are to the volcano, the more vulnerability they are. Although the exposure to damage is high for those living in highly damaged area of Merapi, the resilience is also high. To exposure, the risk of disaster force them to be more prepared to face the disaster and equip themselves with knowledge on disaster risk reduction. They have to be more activity community participatory, and there to the rule and regulation and early warning system imposed in the village. Apart from living the highly damaged area, those groups whose livelihood are in agriculture and also those who have better education also have higher resilience. Sex does not have influence of the level of resilience. However, men have better knowledge regarding disaster risk reduction than women. Age also have negative influence and the level of resilience. Older age group have less resilience than younger one. Policy implication: governance and risk assessment should be taken seriously. Improvement in disaster preparedness, involvement and active participation of members of the community, especially the DA70 group, in the community activities or community meeting where disaster risk reduction is discussed are also important. Above all improvement, the various rules and regulations that allow the prerequisite citizen-based resilience can be applied should be supported. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Yeah, questions from your side?
I always have questions. So I have one question. When you this paper were talking about resilience, it's different from adaptive capacity or coping strategy, and the resilience is something like a community or society respond to the impact, but able to maintain the function and retain the structure of the system, right? So it's not very clear to me that you or where you draw the dividing lines between adaptive capacity or resilience. And when you say you have expert opinions to decide the weight for each dimension of the resilience, and who are the experts. And I think those are very important elements when we talk about resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In this survey, we have two parts. We have the household, we interview the household, and then we also interview the community. And the variables that we use to construct the index will make some based on the response of the community response under the household. But we assume that in here, the resilience is like a community resilience, and the individual that in that community we assume to have the attributes of the community because of that. So this is actually the index, well, we can say the community resilience index, but households that live in that community, we assume to have the trait of the community where they live. So we both use the individual and the community level data. The household level data we look at when we look at the differential in the resilience, who are in the community that are more resilient than the others. That's what we got. And then the second question about the weight, we asked the opinion of experts. In this case, we asked those who have been. This is very. I know we are very. It's very subjective because this is the first. Actually, this is an exploratory, and we don't have any a reference for the weight. So we are using asking the different individuals that have knowledge about the Merapi eruption, the disaster, and so mostly from some of them from the academics, also from the government who is involved in the policy about disaster risk management. So I know this is a very, very subjective, and it's subject to a lot of these things, but in lacking, we don't have any other information. So I open to your suggestion on how we are going to improve to this index. This is a very exploratory work, and in fact, this data based on the first survey in 2012, and now we are fielding the second survey, and the survey was funded by the government to use the information to improve or to do improvement on the risk reduction policy in Merapi.
Thank you. I think it's very important to actually study how people respond and cope with these things. I have a question, though, about the data that you use with regard to the risk for the hazard coming from this National Board of Disaster Management. How do they get their data? Is there something very objective about this, or do they just rely on local officials' opinions? What is your assessment of their... You mean
the survey data?
No, not your survey, but the data you use to classify the regions as high risk, medium risk, and low risk. How does the government do that? What is the basis of that classification?
Okay, I think after the Merapi eruption, they did rapid assessment on the area affected, and then they classify based on the effect of the area. Some area affected by the cold lava, some area affected by the hot lava and other and some area are not affected at all. So this classification based on their rapid assessment. Yes.
I have a small clarification question. In your analysis, you are speaking about households, and you collected data at the household level.
And community.
Yes, but my question is, at the household level, you collected the information only for one person in the household, or you collected individual level information for every person in the household? Because you present in your results, for example, sex. This is the sex of the respondent, the head of the household, the person of reference of the household, or it's each of the women, for example, that are in the household. It's not so clear to me exactly if you have two levels or one level.
Yeah. Thank you very much. In the survey, we asked the question to the head and the spouse, and the head of the household and the spouse. So we do not ask to the every individual in the household.
Yes, I have two questions. These indices have been used also in the Horn of Africa, and one of the issues in relating, let's say, vulnerability and resilience at a more macro level is what we call structural resilience. Mm-hmm. And it can have to do with the resources that the region or the governance or the province has, not just a community, because communities are part of political structure, and some have more influence than others. So, can you measure the resource and political importance of the province or the region in the strength of the response and resilience? And related question is on early warning systems. They've been around for like 40, 50 years. I think your country has an early warning system. Have they been incorporating any of your resilience indicators so they can be more preventive?
Yeah. About the first question is about the government. Sorry, the policy of the government. How we measure on that. Well, as I mentioned, that we interview the head of the head of the community, and also we interview the officials in the government about their perception on various aspects of governance in the Merapi area, and what policy that have been taken, applied, and that's how we get the information and we get the data from the survey. And secondly, your second question I forgot. Your second question is on the early warning system. Well, this survey was commissioned by the institute, management disaster agencies, and the purpose was to incorporate the results of this into their policy. So after the survey, and we presented the result to the government, this has been considered into their planning for the next year planning on the risk management. So we don't know exactly about the early warning system, but we hope that all the recommendations that we have here will be taken care of.
If there are no more urgent questions, I would like to move on to the last talk in this session, which will be by Yuzhu Liu about rural-urban differential vulnerability and its impact on post-disaster well-being. Please come up. Yeah. And thank you very much again.
Policy at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. So before my presentation, I just want to say it's my great pleasure to be here to present my study. I also want to say thank you to the organizing committee to provide me this opportunity. And also, I just want to say this study is a pre-mandatory study. So I just hope that at the end of my presentation that I can provide you a different perspective of seeing vulnerability to disaster in general. So my topic is rural-urban differential vulnerability and its impact on post-disaster well-being. Okay, so here is the outline. First of all, the introduction part, I will give you a general idea of the study. The second part, literature review, I will just show you how I built this theoretical framework. The third part is the methodology, how I approach the research question. The last part is the conclusion on the policy implications. So the background of this study is that globally, there has been seen the increasing costs associated with natural disaster. By the end of 2006, the maximum of the cost is about 230 billion, and the minimum cost is 28 billion. And as vulnerable scholars, they see that the cost is socially based, socially constructed, which means the impact of natural disaster is differently distributed according to one's pre-existing socio-economic status. So this has a further meaning for China, especially for now. So during the past 3 decades, China has witnessed the greatest labor migration in humans' history. And this, on the one hand, this labor migration has generated a rapid economic development. And on the other hand, this labor migration also caused increasing rural-urban disparity and also increasing amount of vulnerable subpopulations. And this has made this study important. So just give you an idea about what's going on in China. So rural-urban migration is the normal phenomenon that can be seen in most of the developing countries. But the fundamental difference in China is because it's widely considered that the Koko system is the most important institutional obstacles that prevent most of the rural migrants to settle down in the urban areas. The Koko system was initially implemented in 1951, aiming at balancing the rural-urban population. So this means if you were born in rural areas, you are entitled as the rural residents, and most of the welfare will go with your Koko identity. So which means if you migrate to the urban area, most of your welfare programs cannot be easily moved into the urban areas. So this just these permanent outsiders of most of the rural migrants just to make them more susceptible to the social discrimination. And so this raises the issues. Since this problem is so important, but what we can see is that there are very few studies focusing on China's, especially focusing on the vulnerability to natural disasters in rural urban settings. And even fewer study has focused on just those subgroups like the rural migrants, the left behind population, and urban citizens, and also the rural population in general. Those people's post-disaster well-being, subjective well-being. So, but it is notable that from some studies that we can see, if we're focusing on females' perspective, their own perspective of post-disaster experience, it's the result is inconsistent with the general vulnerability studies, which means most of the time, sometimes the women can gain more positive outlook during the post-disaster recovery stage. So to address those issues, I propose 3 research questions to investigate this issue. The first one is whether the extreme events provide female disaster victims an opportunity to extend their gender role in general. And the second one, if this is the case, is the similar experience can be found in other subgroups. And the third one is, what are the determinants of disaster victims' post-disaster well-being? So to explain this, we will go to the literature review. First of all, we will focus on the disaster vulnerability. So due to the interdisciplinary, there is no universal definition of vulnerability. But in this study, I just focus on 2 definitions. The first one is according to Winsner 2004. It more describes the vulnerability exists through the the whole process of the natural disaster. And the second one is from the Sussman, etc., 1983. They are more concerned about the social class. Those people with different social class, they are differently affected by the natural disaster. So in this way, we can identify who might be vulnerable to the natural disaster, and also we can investigate what determine their post-disaster recovery. Yeah. So there are 2 main streams of the literature. I think most of you know very well about this, but I just identify those main models and series. So now we will go to a very fast review of those models. The first one is the pressure and release model. This is the pressure side of the model. It shows the vulnerability people, vulnerable people. They are not only under the pressure of the unsafe condition, they are also under the pressure of the magnitude of the natural hazard. So the release side is just the reverse process of this of the pressure side. So in total, this model as well as the access model, they describe the whole process of a natural disaster. And the second one is the marginalization theory. So there is just the important premise of this theory is that after the disaster, the relief aid is decided externally. So it's still under the existing socio-economic structure. So it will, instead of relieve the vulnerability of those disaster victims, it will just reinforce their underdevelopment status. So the third one is more focused on the place-specific vulnerability. And we can also see that the social vulnerability index is focusing on the social vulnerability. But what I want to address is that from those models and the series that we can see, the common advantage of those models and series is the objective perspective of vulnerability has been well addressed. But they neglect they just assume natural disaster victims, they are passive takers of post-disaster situations. And the common disadvantages from the models and the series that we can see is that the subjective perspective of vulnerability has been neglected. So to address the subjective perspective of the well-being, now we turn to the literature review on life satisfaction. So what we can see is that first of all, life satisfaction method has been applied to the environmental economics. First, climate change, the relationship between climate change and the life satisfaction has been well addressed. And also the reduction of air pollution, the impact of reduction of air pollution on people's happiness has also been well addressed. Among those limited attempts, just the Loichinger rescue 2009, they just evaluate the impacts of floods on people's life satisfaction. They investigate this issue based on most of the public goods literature. And the second part I want to show you is that the life satisfaction studies of subpopulations in China. Unlike the vulnerability studies on subpopulations in China, there are growing interest focusing on China's subpopulations in people's daily life. What we can see is that the comparison of life satisfaction among those subgroups has been well addressed, and also the determinants of rural populations' subjective well-being has also identified. But there is just disadvantages of applying subjective well-being in general that we can see if we just focus on the subjective well-being in general. Most of the economic factors will be covered by other non-economic factors that maybe cause some bias. And also, so in this study, I propose to use the subjective economic well-being to measure people's post-disaster status. So in this way, we can well address the physical as well as psychological recovery for those disaster victims. So based on the literature, I propose that the theoretical framework for this study is that people's post-disaster subjective economic well-being is determined by socio-economic and also demographic factors. The first equation is just derived from the general vulnerability series. The second one is that I just want to show you that compared to the vulnerability, the relative vulnerability, which is measured by people's subjective perception, has also an impact on people's post-disaster well-being. So I just give you an idea of the relative vulnerability, because from people's own view of the natural disaster, it can also make a difference, as previous studies has shown. So now we turn to the data and the methodology. The data I'm using is the metadata. It's a comprehensive survey conducted in China in 2004. The purpose is to just give you a baseline indicator of the social and economic development in Western region. And this is the description of the metadata set. I just want to show you that there is obvious disparity between the rural and the urban areas, and also as to the frequency of natural disaster that we can see is more than 50% of the interviewees in this survey, they suffered from the natural disaster in previous year. But here is the problem, because when I got the data set, the indicator for natural disaster is on the level of community. So this caused some difficulties for me to aggregate all these sub data sets together, and I will show you later. So this is the descriptive analysis. Because in this data set there is no clear category of the 4 subpopulations that I want to research on. So the first step, I have to extract the samples from the whole data set to identify who are urban citizens, rural migrants, and left populations, and those rural populations without any migrant family members. Yeah, there are a lot of predictors to do this. So yeah, I think it also will cause some statistical issues. I will show you later. So I also, so on the basis of those sub-samples, I did the comparison of mean scores of SE, subjective economic well-being among those subgroups. So this is my regression attempts. Unfortunately, I would like to do the regression, but I did the cross-tabulation to see the correlation between those variables that I proposed to do the regression. But unfortunately, not many of them are significantly can be included in the this empirical model. So this is just an attempt of random regression. As we can see that, like the disability and chronic disease has some significant impact on those non-left behind rural populations. But what we can find is most of through the 4 subpopulations, the variable that much worse than 5 years ago and worse than 5 years ago, they are significant correlated with the subjective economic well-being in all the cases. The reason I interpret is that maybe it's because people's risk aversion. So instead of comparing the future situation, when people compare to the old times, they would rather to avoid the lost. So that may be the reason. So the conclusion from this study is that natural disaster do have a negative impact on people's post-disaster subjective economic well-being. And what we found is that the female migrants really gain more positive outlook than the male during the post-disaster stage. And the rural women in general, they do not have this similar experience. And also we found that the personal comparison factors are important. Yeah, they are the important factors that determine people's post-disaster subjective well-being. The policy implication from this study is, first of all, the disaster mitigation policies and programs should reflect disaster victims' subjective economic well-being. The second one is that more specifically, the proactive measures and special attention should be given to those female disaster victims, especially to those female rural migrants, because if the government can address that issue, the female migrants, they can really make a difference in the post-disaster recovery. And the last policy implication is that ultimately, since the Koko system is the most difficult institutional obstacles to reform, so we suggest the government should further reform the Koko system and its associated welfare programs to just assist those households that have migrant family members to substantially reduce their vulnerability. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, questions? Oh, yeah.
I might have misunderstood your data. So you have the survey in 2004. So you have the measurement of subjective well-being at one time point, yeah? And then you have the question maybe 1 year earlier, have you experienced natural disaster, or you use the community level to indicate whether a person has experienced disaster or not. So how could the subjective well-being in the year 2004 be affected by the experience of disaster? It could be or it could not be. And if I remember correctly, you shift slightly the focus of your paper because you proposed to look at recovery, the different rates between different groups. I think you have that information in the data. That could be more straightforward because you know that the rate of recovery differs. Like, I think you have information on people rebuilding their house or something like that. So that is quite clearly because it is the effect of the disaster, but subjective well-being at one time point could be quite problematic.
Okay, so when I look into this data set, there are facts about people who suffered the disaster in previous year, and also information about the people suffer from a natural disaster in the last 5 years. But what I want to focus on is that because we don't, this is a cross-sectional data set, so I just want to approximately to consider that those people who suffered, because it's just in last year, but we don't have the specific time, when they suffered from natural disaster. So I approximately consider that people, just those people suffer from natural disaster, and also they may, especially why I use this economic well-being is when people ask to evaluate their economic situations than previous year, they will, most of the time, they will just make the evaluation, make the universal evaluation based on all the situations. Like economic may be part of it, and also they compare with their own situation 5 years ago and in the future. So I think in this way, because we lost the information just 1 year ago, so I just want to say I approximately consider that 1 year is just like immediate, as the immediate the post-disaster recovery stage, to combine those data sets together.
I think Ryan raised a very question. I read your paper actually. I was very interested in the similar topic in Western China, and I have a kind of similar question, like Raya's. I don't know, I didn't understand exactly what you explained. But I guess what you have, do you have this kind of a retrospective questions on what the subjective well-being you have like years before. If that's the case, then maybe you can measure that. Because in your analysis you mentioned that what is most important is this kind of changes, right, over time. That's very the most significant factors that contribute to the well-being. So I don't know if that's the case. And I also, understand that you put this study against the background of Western development strategy in China. And is that, given that you have a policy, this kind of changes, focus on the development in the western part of the country, that will contribute to the both the subjective and objective well-being of the population. So then this kind of makes the kind of impact. So maybe if there is a way to do the kind of distinctive analysis on that, and also you also show that the migrants had a relatively higher subjective well-being than the urban residents. That's kind of interesting, and I don't know if there is a kind of error in the measurement of subjective well-being.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
My question is related to the migrants also. In the context of remittances, you didn't mention anything about basically that in China you have about a quarter of the population of the whole country that is the floating population. 300 million people in China are part of this floating population. Most of them are, as you said, rural people who have moved to the cities. And what we know from international migration is that a lot of labor migrants send back some money home. Eventually, some of them also go back home at some point in their life. And when they go back home, because they have been exposed to urban life and other situations, knowledge, ideas, and so on, they also bring back some let's say, different strategies how to cope with some of the situations. So what about this basically return migrants, but especially remittances and the capacity to adapt for the families that are into these situations? And from the descriptive statistics that you had, it was not so clear to me what's the fraction of your whole population that is in this situation of basically having at least one of the household member away from the community. Are we speaking about 10%, 50%? In the context of China, you have a massive urbanization going on over the last 20 years, and the trend, the official policy of the country is to accelerate even the urbanization of the country. In the context of an increasing number of people living in urban centers, whether it's on the East Coast or inland, the urbanization is also in some ways contributing to some of these changes of adaptability. Thank you.
Thank you. According to the MEDO data set, they just they also interview people where is their regular residence. So there are more than like 21% of the interviewees, they answer that they have other residence other than the main dwelling in the their family main dwelling. So and also they say when they say they live in other residence, there is specific like conditions that they live there more than 6 months. So when I subject those left behind populations, left behind the population. What I did is that to look at those people who were surveyed in the rural region, and also they report one of their also they report they have other residents rather than the main dwelling in rural region. And also there is another predictor saying that there are other residents in, whether it's in urban area or in rural area. So we exclude those whose other residents in rural areas. We focus on those other residents in the urban areas. And then there is another predictor like the family ID. So people who live, whose regular residence in rural regions, if they have the same family ID with those people who have other residences, I consider them as the left behind population. I know this is not a perfect method to do it, but based on the limited information and my purpose of the study, so I did extract the sub-sample in this way. So I think maybe, because there is also another issue is that this data set has not been released to the public. So the application procedure for me is a little bit complicated. So so I still didn't get the. There are also a lot of missing variable, missing informations in those mining sub data sets. So I think if I can get the full data set, or maybe just use another like statistical method, maybe those deficiency can be fixed. But yeah, as you said, I think that's a very good question. I will just keep that in mind. Thank you.
Let's have one last question over here. That's okay.
Thank you for your talk. I think you have been doing very important studies. I have two suggestions, and which may be useful for you to further improve your studies. The first one is that when you're talking about people's consideration about their post-disaster economic well-being, you may want to find some information about the type of disasters and also the magnitude of disaster, same kind of disaster, because they can vary considerably in terms of magnitude. Because there are a lot of studies suggest that depending upon what kind of disaster people experienced and also how serious the disaster was, people's consideration or perception about the disaster, its impact and the recovery can vary considerably. So this is the first suggestion. The second suggestion is that you may want to try to get some information about people's pre-disaster status. People's pre-disaster status could have a great impact on their resilience during the disaster. They can also have some impact about what they're thinking about disaster. Earlier we talked about the sex differentials in the impact of different type of disasters. Just to give you one example, if you look at some historical populations, you find in some of those populations, under the normal condition, female tended to have a higher mortality because many of them disadvantaged in the society. But during the hard time or during the disasters, you found male populations were affected more, or they suffered more relatively. And this is due to the fact because women already get used to the difficult situation. And the information of this kind will help you to interpret the subjective interpretations of people's views about their post-disaster recovery. Thank you.
Thanks again to all the presenters, and thank you very much for your questions and participation in the session. Let's get out to a well-earned lunch. It'll be served on the other side, Raya, am I correct? Where we also had breakfast. And we'll meet here in an hour. Thank you.